Shalom and welcome to Mashiach, Messiah from a true Jewish perspective. In this series of teaching videos, we are going to explore what Jewish sources say about the Mashiach, the Messiah. All of this study will involve only Jewish sources like the Tanakh, obviously, the Talmud, the Targums, the Midrashim, the Zohar, the writings of Philo of Alexandria, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. But we will be looking exclusively at what the Jewish understanding of Messiah has been, and what the Jewish understanding of Messiah is, and what the Jewish understanding of Messiah has been. We should begin with the 12th of Rambam's 13 principles of faith. And I say we should begin here because there are many, sadly, who have begun to talk about the idea of a messianic age in context of the Messiah simply being an allegory, and that the Messiah is not really a person, that the Messiah is just an idea, or the Messiah is an age, a messianic age that we will enter, and not an actual person. And so it is in fact a conclusive element of Judaism, of rabbinic Judaism, as laid out in the 13 principles of Rambam. In the 13 principles of faith, principle 12 says clearly, I believe with perfect faith in the coming of the Messiah, and even though he may tarry, nonetheless, every day, I wait every day for his coming. So belief in the Messiah is a fundamental precept of Judaism. And I want to we're going to explore that in more detail as this study continues. But I want to make it very important that the idea of Messiah is foundational. It's foundational to Judaism. It is not an optional concept within Judaism. And as I said, we're only going to look at truly Jewish sources, not anything not outside of Judaism. Strictly Jewish sources, the Targums, the Talmuds, the Midrashim, the Zohar, maybe the Sefer Yetzirah, the Bahir, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the writings of Philo of Alexandria, but purely Jewish sources. And of course, fundamentally the Torah, the Tanakh in general. And speaking of the Tanakh, this brings up an important subject, and that is the basis for our text of the Tanakh, which is going to enter into these discussions clearly, since we're talking about a concept that is foundational within the Tanakh. And I want to add also, and a reminder, that the concept of Messiah is a purely Oral Torah concept. Okay, it really does not exist outside of the Oral Torah, if you will, from a Karaite perspective, for example. I'm not sure that Karaites believe in the concept of Messiah, but ideally, following their thinking to its logical progression, they shouldn't, to its logical conclusion. Because they have no reason to believe in the concept of Messiah. The term the Messiah is not a term that we find in the Tanakh. The term the Messiah, we find a few references to an anointed one, or a Messiah, but there's all kinds of passages that we will be looking at, and we'll be using Oral Torah sources to determine that they are in fact messianic passages. Such as the Talmuds and the Midrashim and the Zohar. But without these sources, there's no reason to tie all these different passages together into a single dynamic individual known as HaMashiach, the Messiah. The concept, the belief in the Messiah is Jewish, but it's not really Karaite. It's an Oral Torah concept. So if you have a problem with the Oral Torah, you may have a problem with the concept of Messiah. But if you don't have a problem with the Oral Torah, then the concept of Messiah is fundamental to Judaism. But let us discuss the text, because obviously we are talking about the Tanakh. And as you probably know, between the years of 500 and 915 CE, a group of Jewish traditionalists known as Masorites standardized the Hebrew text of the Tanakh. They created what we call the Masoretic text. But it's important to realize that the standardized text, the Masoretic text, did not have, well, the original text, the original Hebrew text, for example, didn't have any vowels. So one of the things the Masorites did was they added vowels. And some of the words that are ambiguous, and you don't know what the word is unless you know what the vowels are. There's a passage, for example, that depending on where you put the vowels, Joseph, I think it was leaning upon a bed or he was leaning upon a staff. I think the Masoretic text has it one way, and the Septuagint, which we'll talk about later, translates it as if the vowels are the other way. Well, it's an Oral Torah concept. There are slight differences between the earliest Masoretic text manuscripts, but not much. But toward the end of the toward the end of the Masoretic era, two families, the Ben Asher family and the Ben Naphtali family, finalized two slightly different Masoretic texts. And most printed editions today use the Ben Asher text. By the way, Ben Asher appears to have been a Karaite, Ben Asher himself. So the Masoretic text is actually a Karaite text. In fact, Saadia Gaon, who preferred the Ben Naphtali system, mentioned Ben Asher in his critiques of the Karaites. In his work Sefer Dikdudi Ha-Ta'amim, Aaron Ben Asher wrote, "The prophets complete the Torah, are as the Torah, and we decide law from them as we do from the Torah. This belief is known to have been held by Karaites." Okay? In contrast to mainline Judaism, which has always maintained that the prophets didn't add to or take from the Torah, but could only understand the prophets as elaborating on the Torah. And documents from the Cairo Geniza also indicate that Ben Asher was, in fact, a Karaite. So the Masoretic text is actually a Karaite text. It doesn't mean it's not of any value, but we must remember its source. It's actually a Karaite production. There are some readings in other versions and manuscripts, such as the Septuagint, however, the Peshitta Tanakh, and the Peshitta is the ancient Aramaic version, the literal Aramaic version, not like the Targums. It was a literal Aramaic translation of the original Hebrew. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, which also preserve for us ancient Hebrew manuscripts of books of our Tanakh, which predate the Masoretic era. And some of these have readings that obviously are more original than readings that we do find in the Masoretic text. I want to look at a couple of examples just to make our case. Psalm 145, Psalm 145 is an acrostic psalm. This means that each line of the psalm began with a different Hebrew letter going through the Hebrew alphabet until we get to the letter Nun. And the letter Nun, the line that would begin with the letter Nun is missing. It goes, it's omitted from the text. There is no Nun line for the letter Nun, which is equivalent of our Hebrew letter N. However, A copy of Psalms that was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, 11Q Psalms A, has this missing section, which says, Yahweh is faithful to all his promises and loving towards all he has made. And the verse also appears in the Septuagint, which is the ancient Greek translation of the Tanakh, and the Peshitta, which is the ancient literal Aramaic translation of the Tanakh. So clearly this noon section belongs in the text, but it's not in our Masoretic text. Isaiah chapter 53, verse 11, we have another example. The literal Hebrew says in the Masoretic text, from the travail of his soul he shall see. It's like there's a blank, a missing word. There's no noun to receive the action. Then it says, shall be satisfied in his understanding. My righteous servant shall justify many, and their iniquities he bears. Again, in the copy in the Dead Sea Scrolls, actually 2 Hebrew copies in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the missing word is light, and it is there. From the travail of his soul he shall see light, and shall be satisfied in his understanding. My righteous servant shall justify many, and their iniquities he bears. So here again, the Masoretic text is lacking. The Septuagint, which is the ancient Greek translation, has the missing word light. 2 copies, Hebrew copies found from the Dead Sea Scrolls that predate the Masoretic text have the word light, but the Masoretic text doesn't have the word light. So we know that the Masoretic text is not perfect. Okay. So in our study, we will draw on multiple texts, not just the Masoretic text, but we will look to the underlying Hebrew text of the Septuagint, the underlying Hebrew text of the Peshitta, and other sources to tell us what the Tanakh says, as well as what the Masoretic text says. And remember, not only is the Masoretic text not perfect, it's a Karaite text. Among, I do want to talk about something called the Masora. The Masora are marginal notes that were transmitted along with the Masoretic text. There's the Masora Parva and the Masora Ketona. They're in the top and the bottom margins. And the notes transmitted on the top margins are called the Masora Magna, and those they're also known as Masora Gedolah. And then there's end notes that are called Masora Finalis. Among these notes that are preserved in the Masoretic text that the Masoretes preserved, there are those known as the Tikkun Soferim. Tikkun Soferim means emendations of the scribes or repairs of the scribes, where the scribes are said to have fixed the text, repaired the text. And among these are 18 indications, 18 notations that indicate places where the Masoretes say that the scribes found the text to be indelicate. And so they modified the text, fixed the text, repaired the text because they thought it was indelicate. And there are also 134 places, not a few, but 134 places where the margins indicate in the Masora that the original word that appeared in the original text of the Tanakh was the Tetragrammaton, Yud-He-Yahweh, and that the scribes in certain instances decided to fix or repair this and replace that word with Adonai. I'm not talking about the practice of pronouncing Adonai when you see the sacred name. I'm saying in the text they actually changed the text to read Adonai, but the margins indicate that the original word there was in fact Yud-He-Vav-He. And in many instances, the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Peshitta version of the Tanakh and sources such as this The Targums even confirm these instances. And then there's several places also where the Masoretic text reads Elohim, but the Masora indicates that the original reading was Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. So likewise, there's places where Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh was repaired, fixed by the scribes to read Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. But, like we said, the Masoretic text is not perfect. We're going to make a whole lot of use of it because it's a great text. The Christians certainly didn't preserve any other Hebrew text, and the Samaritans preserved a different Hebrew text of the Torah, but it's got its problems. But fortunately, we do have other sources. We have a handful of pre-Masoretic Hebrew texts, several in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have the Septuagint, which was translated from the original Hebrew around 250 CE. We'll talk more about the Septuagint later. And we have the Peshitta, which is the literal Aramaic translation. What are the Dead Sea Scrolls? The Dead Sea Scrolls are a collection of manuscripts that were found in caves in the region of the Dead Sea. There were a whole lot of biblical manuscripts, and many of these, very interestingly, they don't always agree with the Masoretic text. Some of them, there's a couple of scrolls of Isaiah, for example, that agree very closely with the Masoretic text, but some minor and important differences, like that instance in Isaiah 53 where the word light appears in both the Septuagint and in the Dead Sea Scroll copies, and yet is lacking from the Masoretic text. There was a copy of 1 Samuel found in Cave 4, for example, that has remarkable agreement with the Greek Septuagint translation against the Masoretic text. The old wisdom used to be that if you're looking at the Septuagint and there was something different from the Masoretic text, that the Greek translators were sloppy, the Greek translators got it wrong. Sometimes that may be the case. But the new approach now, in light of the Dead Sea Scrolls, is to say, maybe the underlying Hebrew text was different from the Masoretic text. The Greek translator, maybe he was working from a different text. A text that read somewhat differently from the Masoretic text. The origin of the Septuagint is recorded by Flavius Josephus, who was a first century Jew. And he records that Ptolemy Philadelphus, somewhere around 250 CE, entered into negotiations with the Jewish high priest to obtain a Greek translation of the Torah for the library at Alexandria. And in fact, a large number of Jewish prisoners were traded for this. And so the Jewish authorities chose 20, according to the tradition at least, chose 72 translators. And these 72 translators translated the Septuagint. So the Septuagint is not only a Jewish text, it was the authorized Greek translation, if you will, produced by 72 Jewish scholars chosen by the Jewish authorities of the time. Now, we said the Torah now, remember. The Septuagint includes more than the Torah. The Septuagint includes the entire Tanakh. So the rest of the Tanakh wasn't translated at that time, but it was translated no later than 150 CE because the wisdom of Ben Sirach in the prologue of the Greek translation, which was translated by Ben Sirach's own grandson, he mentions the Septuagint and the rest of the books, the prophets and the writings, being part of it by 150 CE and widely distributed. So certainly by 150 CE, the Septuagint included the entire Tanakh, not just the Torah. The Greek Septuagint is very important to us because it preserves a pre-first century text that the holder of the Septuagint had prior to the first century. So It's the oldest translation of the Tanakh into another language. Then there's the Aramaic Peshitta Tanakh. And is really an underutilized, underrecognized text. The Peshitta is a literal Aramaic translation. It's not like the Septuagint, it's not like the Targums, which are paraphrases. It's a literal word-for-word translation. And that's very useful because Aramaic and Hebrew are cognate languages. So word-for-word translation of a Hebrew document into an Aramaic document gives you a real good idea what that Aramaic document says. A lot better idea than, say, a Greek translation or an English translation does. Because the grammar and the even the vocabulary are so similar. The Syriac version of the Tanakh is mentioned by Melito Sardis as early as the 2nd century CE. And there are a number of traditions, but they're indicating the origin of the Peshitta. But suffice it to say that the Peshitta is very definitely of Jewish origin. I don't think there's any doubt about that. There's a good deal of evidence for the Jewish origin of the Peshitta. The Peshitta appears actually to be mentioned in the Talmud 3 times. In the Babylonian Talmud, page 10b, the Shabbat 10b, Rosh Hashanah 33b, and Megillah 10b. So 3 times there are references to the Peshitta readings, and they're cited as if they're authoritative readings in the Talmud. The books of Ezekiel and Proverbs and the Peshitta are very similar to the Aramaic Targums of those books. There's a very close relationship. The Peshitta has Jewish liturgical divisions in it. The Psalms are divided into 5 sections, for example, as in ancient Jewish copies. The Torah is divided into the triennial cycle of Torah reading, and the festival readings are also indicated. Moreover, the Peshitta Torah has many headings which are likely of Jewish origin. For example, above the 10 Commandments, there is a reading, there's a division indicating the 10 Commandments. And just above Leviticus 17, the Peshitta heading has a heading that says the Torah of offerings and sacrifices, which is comparable to what we read in the Babylonian Talmud in Megillah 30b. The indication is that the Peshitta was originally written in Hebrew letters. So there's a good deal of evidence to indicate that the Peshitta is in fact a Jewish source in its original form. So these are the sources that we're going to be looking at when we talk about the text of the Tanakh. As well, we're going to be looking at the Talmud, the Targums, and so on. Now, we're talking about the identity of the Messiah. And I want to talk, in this series, we're going to learn about who the Messiah is, what his purpose is, what he accomplishes, and what it means to us. Particularly who the Messiah is. The identity of the Messiah is crucial according to the Torah. Deuteronomy, Devarim, chapter 18, verses 18 through 19 says, I will raise them up a prophet from among their brothers like unto you, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak unto them all that I shall command him. And it shall come to pass that whosoever will not hearken unto my words, which he shall speak in my name, I will require it of him. Now, what does that mean? I will require it of him. We're going to find out. The 13th century rabbinic commentator Rabbi Levi ben Gershon writes concerning this passage, this is what he says. A prophet from the midst of you. In fact, the Messiah is such a prophet, as it is stated in the Midrash Tanhuma in the verse, Behold, my servant shall prosper. That's Isaiah 52:13, by the way. Moses, by the miracles which he wrought, brought a single nation to worship Elohim, but the Messiah will draw all peoples to worship of Elohim. So what does the Midrash Tanahum say, which Ralbag cites? Well, Midrash Tanhuma to Isaiah 52:13 says this: "It is written, Behold, my servant shall deal wisely. He shall be exalted and extolled and be very high." Isaiah 52:13. It means he shall be more exalted than Abraham, of whom it is written, I lift up my hand. Genesis 14:22. He shall be more extolled than Moses, of whom it is said, as a nursing father bears the nursing child. Numbers 11:12. And shall be very high. That is, Messiah shall be higher than the ministering angels. So this is definitely talking about Messiah. Maimonides, Rambam, in a letter to a Yemenite community, denounced a man who was claiming to be the Messiah. And this is what the Rambam says: the Messiah will be a very great prophet, greater than all the prophets, with the exception of Moshe, our teacher. His status will be higher than that of the prophets and more honorable, Moses alone excepted. The Creator, blessed be He, will single him out with features wherewith He has not singled out Moses. For it is said with reference to him, and his delight shall be in the fear of Yahweh, and he shall not judge after the sight of his eyes, neither shall decide after the hearing of his ears. Isaiah 11:3. So the prophet, like Moses, is greater than any other prophet, according that we read of in Deuteronomy 18, verses 18 through 19, is in fact the Messiah. The Dead Sea Scrolls, in a document called 4Q175, also speak of a messianic figure. It's very clearly speaking of the Messiah. And it applies Deuteronomy 18 through 19, indicating that the prophet, like Moses, was understood clearly as referring to the Messiah as far back then as the Hasmonean period. Now, remember, in our Torah, Deuteronomy 18:19, Deuteronomy 18:19, the Torah says, those who do not give heed to the Messiah, it says, I, speaking of Elohim, will require it of him. What does this mean? What does it mean? I will require it of him. The Targum Onkelos to this phrase, that's the Targum, the authoritative Targum of the Torah. You see, in ancient times, it was outlawed to read the Torah in the synagogues. And so they would read the Aramaic paraphrase. Eventually they read the Torah and the Aramaic paraphrase. The Aramaic paraphrase of the Targum would not just say what the Torah said, it would tell what they understood the Torah to mean. So it's a very valuable tool because the Targum tells us what our fathers thought Torah meant. Targum Onkelos is that Targum. It was the ancient Targum that was read in the synagogues. The Targum Onkelos says of this phrase, very strong wording, it says, my word, my memra, shall take vengeance upon him. My memra. The memra is a very, very significant word in the Targums and in Kabbalah. The memra is the, it's the essentially a personification of Elohim. It is his word, the Torah incarnate. Okay? My word shall take vengeance upon him. The Greek Septuagint translator rendered the phrase to take very similarly, I shall take vengeance upon him. So certainly the Torah foretells not only the coming of Messiah, but this is key. The Torah, our Torah, requires every Torah observant Jew to accept the Messiah once he has come. So it seems very important as a matter of Torah observance to understand who the Messiah is and to give heed to him. That's the conclusion of our first study, and we'll continue this study in our next lesson. I hope you will join us. Until then, shalom.